So welcome to the deep dive on ocean acidification and ocean climate impacts. My name is Dr. Helen Findlay and I'm from Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK, and I'm also representing the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network. So we're really pleased to be able to join this data and science session to explore the innovative and inclusive actions for addressing the impacts of ocean acidification. And I'm really excited that we have a great panel here joining us today. I have a co-moderator here, Dr. Lisa Suartoni from the National Resources Defense Council in the USA. And our panelists, I'll quickly introduce them before we dive straight into this topic. We have my pleasure to announce the UK Department of Environment, Food, Rural Affairs Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor Gideon Henderson, the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, Government of Chile, Minister Kuv, the Office of Washington State Governor Jay Inslee, Senior Ocean Advisor Jennifer Hennessy from the USA Pacific region. We have the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission Habitat Services Director, Fran Wilshosen, and the Mook Seafood Farms Director of Research and Development, Dr. Meredith White from the USA Atlantic region. So a really great panel ranging from stakeholders, industry, through community levels, right up to high level government panelists. So I'm going to briefly just frame the science behind ocean acidification, and before we move on to my co-host Lisa, who will talk a little bit about the policy before we get on to asking some of the panelists some questions. So we're not going to dive into ocean acidification in terms of the chemistry or the science particularly. I think that's out there for people to see. But I will just say that over the last 250 years, the oceans have absorbed about 560 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And it's this natural, this unnatural, this current observed rate of change that's unprecedented over the last 300 million years, which is causing concern in terms of ocean acidification. It's resulted in a change in ocean chemistry and an increase in acidity in the surface waters by about 30%. So the chemistry, the science is clear, and we have a lot of information about how that chemistry change will impact a lot of the marine ecosystem, the organisms that live there and their habitats as well. So although some of the science behind that impacts on ecosystems and society is still being developed and investigated, we have a lot of concern, and some of the impacts are already being felt, especially in fisheries and shellfish communities. So that's why we have this panel here today to bring together some of these people really involved right at the direct level to talk about the actions that we can take on ocean acidification. We are committed to a certain level of ocean acidification. Further acidification can only be stopped by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so we do need that high level engagement. However, mitigation and adaptation actions can be used to alleviate the impacts at much more regional and local levels, and particularly in context of multiple stressors, warming, deoxygenation, fishing, pollution. So we hope to discuss here today how across these different levels, from industry, community, state to intergovernmental, how can we bring together that science and data to create action? And I really feel that we will be able to do that with our panelists today. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa now to just bring us up to speed with the policy side.
Thanks, Helen. I'm really excited to facilitate this panel today, and I'd like to thank the World Economic Forum, the OA Alliance, and Plymouth Marine Laboratory for helping to maintain focus and momentum on the important topic of ocean acidification. This is an important moment in time for the ocean and the broader climate conversation. We're just on the heels of the Blue COP, and we're about to initiate the very first formal oceans dialogue in the UNFCCC. It's hard to believe that it's been 16 years since the very first symposium on the ocean and high CO2 world, but here we are, and the OA community has played an important role in getting us to this point, and they no doubt will play an important voice in that conversation and a source of motivation moving forward. So today I'm eager to hear from the members of that community and how they're contributing to this conversation. and to learn about the concrete actions that government, sovereign nations, businesses, scientists are taking to better understand the problem of ocean acidification and to reduce its threat. So with no further ado, let's get to our first topic of conversation, which will be about collaboration. Ocean acidification is a relatively new field of scientific inquiry, and it's noteworthy that how quickly it's been developing so far. As someone who's observed this from the vantage point of a policy practitioner, I've always been impressed by the role of partnerships in its rapid development. In this first panel, we'll hear about those partnerships and the value of sharing information. Let's begin with Professor Henderson. Professor, the UK has really been a leader on OA and other ocean climate issues through collaborations like the Commonwealth Blue Charter, welcoming the Northeast Hub for the Global Ocean Acidification Network, and now as role as president of COP26. In this landscape, why is it now more important than ever to collaborate internationally? And how can the UK help ensure that ocean impacts like OA, warming, deoxygenation, continue to stay as top priority in climate discussion, particularly within UNFCCC and the opportunity that the Ocean Dialogue presents?
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for highlighting some of the UK leadership in the past here and for posing some interesting questions. It's very good to see some familiar faces on the screen today on what is a very low carbon emission meeting, and that's to the benefit of ocean acidification, of course. So I want to start my brief comments by saying, with the context of international collaboration being important, that science is one of the reasons why that is true. The science is international. It doesn't matter whether you're in the South Pacific or the Arctic, but the nature of the chemical response of the oceans to CO2 rise is the same. So we need to share that scientific evidence. There are more than 200,000 species in the ocean that are known about already, and countless more besides. How they respond to that change of chemistry and how the ecosystems that they live in respond is phenomenally complicated. We can't help to solve that as one lab or one nation. We need to collaborate to see how that chemistry impacts the ecosystems around the world and understand them scientifically. The other reason why we need to collaborate is because the problem is a global problem. CO2 rise happens across the whole atmosphere and drives acidification around the whole ocean. We can't solve this problem by working alone. We have to solve it by working together. In that context, how is the UK seeking to continue to ensure that the oceans stay important in international dialogues? The second half of the question you posed here. Well, the change in ocean that's caused by CO2 rise is substantial. Of course, you've said already that it's ocean acidification, it is deoxygenation. There's also the loss of sea ice in the Arctic, the rising sea levels on our coasts, the threat that changing ocean circulation will alter either heat transport or CO2 uptake of the ocean. One of the things that we have to do in the UK and internationally through our partnerships is to continue to represent those challenges and those threats that the ocean is presenting us with as a consequence of climate change, and to make sure that they are understood and they drive forward the need to lower our CO2 emissions globally. We need to continue, therefore, to keep oceans on the agenda. One of the ways in which the UK is striving to use that impetus to achieve reduced emissions is through leadership towards net zero. And the clear UK ambition to reach net zero and the attempt to lead the rest of the world in that direction with other countries following that pathway, I think is a clear way towards that leadership. We also must recognise that climate's not the only threat on the oceans. As you've mentioned, pollution and over-extraction of resource are other threats. And we must tackle those at the same time for the oceans, and do so through collaboration internationally. UK leadership in those areas include our push towards 30% of the oceans being protected as MPAs by 2030, and our strong support for the idea that nature can be part of the solution, and we can use nature-based solutions to tackle many different aspects of the threat and the change that the ocean is going through at the moment. And I want to end by coming back to science. Another area that we can all lead on scientifically with respect to the ocean is through active participation in the UN Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, which kicks off next year and gives us an opportunity to really apply more science to some of the challenges that the ocean faces and to keep the ocean challenge on the climate agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Huhne, as outgoing president of the COP, Chile created the Platform for Science-Based Ocean Solutions, which is meant as a guide for countries working to incorporate mitigation and adaptation actions into their NDCs. How are regional monitoring networks and bilateral learning exchanges helping to inform this platform?
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much for the invitation. Good afternoon to all of you speakers, organizers, viewers, and friends of science around the world. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I see familiar faces as well, and I'm very pleased that we can contribute to this panel, especially on the topic of oceans, as the outgoing president of COP25, outgoing presidency of COP25, and in collaboration with COP26. So the Platform of Science-Based Ocean Solutions is the Chilean COP25 initiative, a contribution to the Blue COP, which seeks to generate a confluence space for the community of ocean climate specialists. The platform aims exactly at addressing ocean and climate issues collaboratively, just as Gideon mentioned before me. The initial component of this platform is a web page to provide policymakers with the best available science, practices, and on-the-ground examples of nature-based solutions for the inclusion of the ocean in climate strategies, covering all relevant reporting and planning documents under the UNFCCC. At the Ministry of Science, we're directing our own effort to integrate some of our own initiatives to the platform. In particular, our climate change observation system, which is part of what we call the Data Observatory, which is a new initiative, public-private, that's going to be built in Chile to provide access to data from different aspects of our science. We're going to start with astronomy, but very soon we're going to open to climate change. The observatory will include an ocean monitoring component that I will discuss more in the next topic. And the platform may be also consulted by stakeholders to inform other processes. Going back to the Ocean Solution Platform, it also includes a work program with meetings, so it's not just a website, a program with meeting, workshops, and parallel events in order to promote solutions, detect new methodologies and tools, and generate collective learning spaces and lessons. The COVID-19 emergency has altered many of our activities for 2020, affecting us and the world in multiple ways. Once we can resume our normal activities, then we will resume also our ocean compromise, which is a part of our international agenda. What we're concentrated today is on building a very strong website to be up and running within the shortest possible time. And the main components of the platform will be a repository of key scientific resources, policy guidance and key resources for policymakers, and a repository of practice-based specific solutions. For example, successful approaches for marine and coastal climate change adaptation and mitigation, particularly nature-based solutions. This will make use of the existing Panorama web platform, a partnership initiative funded by the German government that will be also part of our ocean-based platform. So this is one of our initiatives. This is something that we launched at the COP25, and very happy to promote it in our way to COP26, with which we plan to continue our collaboration, and very happy also that the ocean is also one of the main topics for COP26, just like it was for the Blue COP25. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I think since we got a little bit late start, we should probably turn to topic 2 and proceed. So Helen?
Sure. Yep. So we've probably got a little bit of time.
You would like to take one more question from Ms. Hennessy? That
Can we
would
do
be
one more?
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's do one more.
So, Ms. Hennessy, the state of Washington is a small state making a big impact on the issue of ocean acidification for the past decade. Why did Washington State decide to co-create the OA Alliance? And what role does the state see that subnational governments can play within international ocean climate discussions?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to my co-presenters and all of those attending today. As Gideon mentioned, early on in our efforts to address ocean acidification impacts in Washington State, we recognized the global scale of the problem and that we simply cannot fully address the issue alone. And so collaboration really was key, not just in our region, but internationally. And so the OA Alliance really provides that platform for collaborative action to make sure that we really are taking the kinds of steps that we need to at a global scale. And subnational governments like the state of Washington play an important role within those dialogues in a few key ways. One, by raising the bar, by sharing our experiences with tangible impacts to the ocean from climate change, we are able to really raise the urgency and ambition for climate action. Secondly, we're connecting the dots. For too long, the ocean has been off to the side of climate conversations. And this last year, we were really heartened to be part of the Blue COP and really making sure that we're integrating the ocean into our climate efforts and into those climate commitments, plans, and action and policy actions that we're taking. And you know, we have case studies and examples across our network of members that we're now able to help share through, for example, the platform that Minister Huhne mentioned. So we feel like that's a very valuable role we can play, is by sharing that knowledge and those experiences and examples. And finally, you know, really inspiring action and sharing knowledge. Really, the scientific understanding on this issue is still emerging. And so by sharing not just the scientific information that all of our members are learning about what species and communities are vulnerable across the world, but also the tangible actions that we can take, no matter what the scale of government we are, to help contribute to solving this problem. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Helen, you want to move on to panel 2?
Sure. Thanks. So, yeah, if we move on to the second conversation, which is assessing vulnerabilities and prioritizing actions. So we're really starting to drill down now. Although oceanification happens globally, in order to understand vulnerabilities, we need to really understand what's going on at a much more local level. We know that regionally, scientifically, oceanification can be influenced by local conditions, rivers, proximity to land, sea ice if you're in the polar regions, and other stressors. And personally, I'm involved with one network that I feel has played a key role in bringing together regions, yet maintaining that global conversation, and hopefully we can discuss a range of these later. So the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, over the past 5 to 10 years or so, it's a very much bottom-up driven community where we've been looking at solutions and monitoring. But they've put together a lot of regional hubs, and here at PML we lead the Northeast Atlantic Ocean Acidification Hub, which has been supported by the Department of Environment, Rural Affairs and Fisheries in the UK. But we've also had great partnerships and exchanges with Chile, who also have the Latin American Ocean Acidification Network as part of one of their hubs. So I think just in the region of time and fairness to all our speakers, we'll move straight to Director Wilson, excuse my pronunciations. The regional hubs have been great at capacity building and training, and moving forward, hopefully they'll bring us together to share data better. But I think the treaty tribes of the Pacific Northwest, they're co-managers of resources within their usual and accustomed areas, and have treaty reserved rights entitling them to half of the harvestable marine resources in those areas. So it's very much a regional analysis for you guys. What is the significance of salmon, shellfish, and other marine resources to you and other tribes? And in what ways are you working to better prepare for future impacts on salmon and other culturally significant places and species?
Well, Helen, thank you, and thanks for having me here today, and everyone, thank you. My name's Fran Will Susan, so you did pretty well with that. That's a hard name to pronounce, I know. And I'm kind of acting as a member of this panel, but also as a sun blocker right now. So if I turn my camera off or I'm moving around, it's because I'm trying to keep the picture as best as possible. And I am the Habitat Services Director here at the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. We're an organization that is formed by our 20-member tribes. And these tribes are very unique, really globally. And so it's really a pleasure and kind of exciting to be here talking to you all today. In that they have reservations and places that are their homelands, like you would expect, but they also have very broad extraterritorial management authorities. And so we work with Jennifer in the state of Washington as co-managers of many of these resources and on many of these actions that are so critical. And like the state of Washington, like you all, the tribes understand that they can't do this alone. And that's why we want to participate and are grateful for the OA Alliance and being able to participate in that. Also on the panel, not specifically on the panel, but with us today, you can see Tommy Moore's name. He's a oceanographer, also working for the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, and Eliza Giddis, who's our climate scientist. To me, I wanted to point those folks out because that shows the commitment and the importance of this issue to our member tribes, that they're employing these kinds of experts and technical resources to support them. As far as how important is it, there is no way to quantify or overstate the significance of salmon, shellfish, and marine environments to the tribes of the Pacific Northwest. Just as a quick story, during treaty times, that's back in the mid-1800s here, the idea was to move tribes onto reservations out of their kind of broad, across the landscape kind of life way. And as they were identifying and populating these reservations, the idea that they could convert them to farmers seemed like it was going to be possible. And so the US government spent lots of time getting equipment and being ready to train these people to become farmers. And the Makah tribe is one of our tribes out in the peninsula here. They actually, there's records where they took the pitchforks that were provided to them and actually turned them into halibut hooks so that they could continue their own lifeways. Salmon and shellfish really define who the tribes are as people and communities. And when the treaties were negotiated with the United States, access to these resources were prioritized. The biggest work that tribes are doing out here is about resiliency. It's about recreating ways to adapt and reinforce the watersheds in their homelands. And so we're doing a lot of work on riparian protection. We're trying to address the regulatory infrastructure and rules across the landscape. We're doing restoration and protection to try to create some resiliency and deal with the effects of the watershed on issues like ocean acidification. So I think that that's probably as much as I could say right now on this question, but I wanted to go back just for a minute to the first one when I, just to very quickly tell you that tribes' connection with place is both an incredible strength here, but an incredible vulnerability as well. These are place-based rights, stories, and histories. They can't move. When the resources are affected or when the lands or the waters that they depend on are affected, it's the death of the culture. And so I want to just bring that forward and leave it there.
Thank you. That's a really important point that we need to take into consideration, the cultural aspects as well. So moving to Dr. White then, to follow up on an industry level, what type of monitoring work has Mook Sea Farm taken on to better understand how local waters are changing? And how has Mook Sea Farm helped to lead discussions in the state about the importance of assessing the economic impacts of ocean acidification and changing conditions?
Thank you. Thanks so much for this question and for having me be part of this panel today. Mook Sea Farm started to have problems with larval production in 2009, and it was quickly determined that these problems were associated with ocean acidification. So starting in 2014, Mook Sea Farm has run a nearly continuous seawater monitoring system. It measures, or in some cases calculates, PCO2, temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, pH, and saturation of the seawater that's pumped into our hatchery. We don't use these data for day-to-day hatchery management, but we use a small, simple handheld pH meter for that. The seawater monitoring system data provide us with information about how the local water chemistry is changing on a seasonal level, and then at this point, for over 6 years. We, members from Mook Sea Farm, have served on the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network Steering Committee, and we've also served on the Steering Committee for the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership, or MOCA. And MOCA came to be as a result of the Maine Ocean Acidification State Commission, which was a legislative commission that ran in 2014. And that's actually how I met Bill Mook, the owner of Mook Sea Farm, when both of us were serving on that commission. Our participation in these groups has been to share how ocean acidification and general ocean climate change are affecting the shellfish aquaculture industry, and to recommend actions that can be taken at the local, state, and regional levels to mitigate the impacts on the aquaculture industry, and also on the coastal ecosystem in general. We do work to engage other shellfish industry members, but because effects of ocean acidification have mainly been experienced by hatcheries and not grow-out operations, that engagement has been limited. And Bill Mook is currently serving on the Maine Climate Council Coastal and Marine Working Group, which works to evaluate short and long-term strategies for adaptation and resiliency to ocean climate change in the state of Maine. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much for that insight into the monitoring activities that are going on there. I think we'll just leave with one final comment from Minister Kruve, if we can, on this topic. Chile obviously has been a leader for the Latin American Oceanification Network. So looking at slightly higher level, but also at the local monitoring level, how is the work being done by LOACA helping to advance coastal and local monitoring to better understand local conditions? And why, in your opinion, and from a perspective from Chile, is it important to ensure that local science is informing assessments of socioeconomic and cultural vulnerability?
Thank you very much, Helen. I'd first like to say that that the ocean is really at the heart of the Chilean identity. And in our coastal ecosystem is very long and it's very heterogeneous. We have river discharges, we have upwelling areas, we have the ice melting, glaciers in the fjords in the south of Chile, and many drivers of seawaters that drive pH and CO2 variability in this long range. A recent study demonstrated that marine populations experience variable periods of exposure to low pH and to high CO2. And we need to consider that this is a very complex system. Along the coastline, there are many peculiarities about our territorial sea, including areas that are very sensitive to human induced impacts, such as channels and fjords, which are very, very sensitive to this manipulations. There is also a large number of cities, highly dependent on the generosity of our oceans, fisheries, transport, tourism, and more. And we also need to consider the a governance challenge, as many public institutions have a say in drafting ocean policy, sovereignty, conservation, and exploitation. Our marine ecosystems are indeed very sensitive to acidification changes. And so we think that monitoring and studying these changes and variations is absolutely key to finding solutions. We know that our scientists have been monitoring our oceans and coastlines for years now. And some of our most renowned scientists have been working indeed in initiatives like the LAOC OCA. It is of high importance to bring together a broadly multidisciplinary approach, as you mentioned, since the affectation of the ocean has at the same time an impact in the ecosystem and also on the livelihood of so many local communities with their own diversity. We're talking about vulnerability, and I think that one of the vulnerabilities that we see as a Ministry of Science is the lack of information. The information is also distributed very heterogeneously across the world in terms of how much we know of the ocean. This is why we are currently developing our Climate Change Observatory, which is a distributed technological infrastructure, part of a network of scientists and instruments that will observe our nature, providing us with value-added data for the progress of science and especially for evidence-based policy decision-making. We will build this system with public capacities, including equipment such as satellites, sensors, data-centric platforms, logistics, and others, and financing the acquisition of new ones, and bringing together our scientific community, citizens, and the private sector in this very innovative initiative that helps to tackle vulnerability in a very different way, which is to provide information for decision-making. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll pass over to Lisa again for the final topic. Lisa?
Lisa, your microphone is blocked.
Thank you. So we're going to take a slightly deeper dive into the topic of adaptation in this final panel of questions. As we all know, adaptation can often be an abstract concept that receives too little attention in climate and ocean policy. But I believe that the OA community has provided some of our best examples, some of our best real-world examples of what adaptation looks like, what the benefits are, and how we can foster it. So I'd like to begin with Director Will Susan. You already alluded to the importance of resiliency and adaptation in the tribe's work on ocean acidification, given how highly exposed the tribe is to the impacts of OA and other climate stressors, but also, you know, what's at stake for the tribes. So I'm wondering if you can go into a little bit more detail on what you're doing to reduce the worst impacts of OA.
Well, and feel free to, all of you and Lisa, to ask for more detail if I don't give enough, because it's hard to gauge on something like this of how much to give. But it's really watershed and homeland resiliency are the #1 priority, as I mentioned before. And tribes are working through restoration of ecosystem function, protection of those same functions, and then ultimately trying to maintain connectivity of the aquatic systems that sustain them. There's legal processes going on to work on some of that, but also partnerships and just down in the watershed level work that's happening. Science, tribes have incredible depth and capacity in science. They're conducting regulatory oversight. They're concerned about their cultural and economic kind of revitalization in a clean, sort of sustainable way, as well as political activism. All these are part of that. So ocean acidification and the effects of global climate change, it affects almost every aspect of the treaty reserved resources, these salmon and shellfish that I mentioned before, run timing, and really just their very existence, let alone access. Tribes are contributing to what I want to kind of the 3 pieces I want to hit on is the science, quality science to try to understand and effectively respond, but also combining that with the strength of their traditional knowledge. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. And then tribal leadership provides really powerful political strength as they really work to bring the commitments that are embodied in their treaties to the decision-making that's so important to making this adaptation and resiliency real. So I talked about the traditional knowledge and science to try to understand these environmental changes and implementation of these adaptation strategies. And there's some real basic work that's going on, just doing vulnerability assessments. Where are they on the landscape? What is the concern? What can they do? There's a certain amount of hoping you can stop what's happening, but there's also some adaptation that has to happen. So conducting individual vulnerability studies and then related adaptation plans, and then beginning to implement those. And none of this happens, I shouldn't say none of it, not much of it happens singularly. It happens in watersheds across the state, across the country, and as you all know, as we're trying to carry out more today, around the globe. So some specific examples. Some of our tribes are participating in developing a network of sensors that measure changes in the marine chemistry. Another example, and I'm just going to read from a list here, is studying some of the traditional shellfish management techniques, just to see how they might be able to help buffer the effects of ocean acidification. And this is one of my favorite ones to talk about because it really is a moment where tribes are finding out that their historical knowledge, their stewardship, their millennia on the landscape brings forward some potential understanding that could have big effect today. Clam gardens, or something that was used just how long ago, time immemorial kind of speaking. And we're finding out today that reviving that idea of really managing the nearshore landscape could create some additional resiliency to being able to maintain those species that are so important to tribal culture. The Makah tribe is pioneering a geochemical analysis to try to track the effects of ocean acidification on some of their shellfish resources. The Suquamish tribe is going the education route. They're working on curriculum and getting it into the schools and helping to build understanding of what this means here and how people can help. Here at the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, we're working to support our tribes in facilitating a ocean acidification research project that will be collaborating all those things that will help to bring together the strength of the individual tribes. In Western Washington, there's a tribe in almost every watershed, and they have management authorities across all the waters. And so that place-based strength combined with the state of Washington and other NGOs and folks across the region is a pretty powerful tapestry. And so we're trying to help connect that. And then the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission and 5 of our member tribes have joined as an affiliate, the commission as an affiliate member and tribes as government members with the Ocean Alliance. So Ocean Acidification Alliance. So those are just some quick examples. And if you want, if there's more detail, I'd be happy to talk more about that.
Great, thank you. That's a rich portfolio of work. Dr. White, Mook Sea Farm, as you know, has been on the leading charge to explore innovative adaptation and resilience strategies. I'm wondering if you could describe how the hatchery is doing 2 things: working to buffer seawater, and also how they're exploring the ability to selectively breed tolerance for OA and maybe some other stressors in the oysters.
Thank you. So in the hatchery, we are pumping water into tanks on land. That means we can control every aspect of the water. We're not working in an open watershed, and that's important to understand. We've determined that when we buffer the seawater that we use in our oyster hatchery, we have significantly more reliable larval and juvenile production. So since 2009, we buffer all of the seawater used in the hatchery. We use really simple handheld pH meters. They're relatively inexpensive, and we don't need climate scale, climate quality pH measurements to do this. For our flow-through systems, we have a pH controller system that adds buffer as needed. Consistently, the water that we're pumping into our hatchery has a pH between 7.8 and 7.9. We always buffer to a minimum of 8.2. Now, many oyster hatcheries on the east coast of the United States depend on selectively bred lines of broodstock that have been maintained at shellfish breeding laboratories in Virginia and New Jersey. These labs have been selecting mainly for disease resistance and also for the appearance of the oysters. We feel that the time is here that these groups should start selecting for resistance to, for resistance to environmental stressors, including ocean.
Oops. Oh dear, looks like Dr. White is frozen. I'm wondering if we should pivot.
Shellfish lines we grow.
Oh,
I think I cut out. I'm so sorry for that.
That's all right. Please feel free to finish that last thought because we didn't hear it.
Okay, I am not quite sure where I cut out, but I will just say, because shellfish aquaculture depends so heavily on hatchery produced seed, it gives us an opportunity for resilience because we can breed that resistance to environmental stressors into the lines of shellfish that we are producing. And that's just traditional selective breeding where you're selecting for the traits that you're looking for. So excuse me for that, thank you.
Oh no, thank you. It's fascinating work. So Ms. Hennessy, moving to Washington State, beginning, pardon?
Can I quickly
yes,
interrupt as a
please.
co-host? I understand Minister Huhne needs to be heading out, so can we give him a quick last word and then head over to Jennifer?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So Minister Huhne, one thing that we're particularly interested in finding out about is how bilateral and multilateral agreements can play a role in advancing these on-the-water innovative solutions that are working at a local level.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the agreements and international cooperation are really important, required to empower the local communities, to get the local communities involved in these processes. And I'll just make the case for two examples. One of them is what happened at COP25. At COP25, attending the COP25 and having the Chilean presidency allowed us to coordinate a group of scientists that worked for the entire year. We had more than 260 scientists working in 7 groups throughout the year, and one of them was in particular in the topic of oceans. They gave us recommendations, and now we're turning those recommendations into a plan of action, which includes the climate change observatory, as I mentioned before. So basically, the international community making a multilateral call, and then the local scientists responding very, very actively with something that will be very valuable locally. The second is what we have been knowing and learning about the Chile-California Council, which has been developing a very strong program of coastal research, of coastal action in a way that involves the research community, the private communities, ONGs, NGOs, and also other actors. So basically from this, in this case, a bilateral sort of communication, then we bring it down to the local level by interacting with multiple types of communities, including research and local communities. So I would say that to us in the Ministry of Science, these international networks, both at the multilateral and bilateral level, really help us to get down to earth the Chilean scientific community working in specific topics and interacting with different actors that we now consider essential in what we call the science ecosystem. That really needs to provide the knowledge, the technology, and the innovation for these solutions. Thank you very much, and I apologize I have to leave, but it's been a real pleasure to share this initiative with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Minister Huhne, and have a good day. So I think we have time for another few questions, or at least one more question. Back to Ms. Hennessy in Washington State. Ever since the Blue Ribbon Panel way back in 2012, feels like a while ago, Washington State has been investing in adaptation strategies and researching, resilience. Can you describe some examples of how Washington has approached the policy and partnerships that are important to pursuing those strategies?
Yes, great, thank you so much. It has been a long time that Washington's been working on ocean acidification, and the fact that we had a comprehensive plan really did lay a foundation for us and a roadmap for continuing collaboration. So that Blue Ribbon panel brought together affected business interests like the shellfish industry, academic scientists and researchers from our universities and federal and state agencies, as well as other important governments like tribes that really play an important role in understanding and managing the resources. So, it was that diversity that really helped us lay that foundation. And since that time, we've been able to do things like investing in monitoring at shellfish hatcheries that, as Dr. White mentioned, have allowed them to adjust the pH coming into those hatcheries and improve the survival of the larval shellfish. There's also been work in a public-private partnership to evaluate the role that aquatic vegetation like kelp can play in buffering seawater. And we've invested in our state agencies in doing further research around that topic, trying to understand, again, these nature-based solutions and how they might be able to help with adaptation and resilience of the ecosystem. We also have invested in an OA center at the University of Washington, which is really designed to help support and connect the variety of researchers and scientists doing work in this field. And that has enabled us to do a couple of things, in addition to just the foundational science of monitoring the system and helping people understand what's going on. They have worked to develop a forecast model that's a short-term model that looks out 3 days and provides those conditions that are expected. And that's a really valuable thing for, again, adaptation by the industry in terms of their practices. They're also looking at what other species might be vulnerable to ocean acidification and which ones might have some additional adaptive capacity or be a little bit more resilient to ocean acidification. So we're learning more about the variety of species that could be at risk, but also what are those species that might do better. And for example, our native Olympia oyster appears to be one of those species that may be more resilient to ocean acidification. So that's a really important tool for us and important information for us to have. And then finally, in terms of other adaptation, we're looking at better understanding the other stressors that can exacerbate global ocean acidification. So we know that local nutrients that come off the land from wastewater treatment plants or land-based practices can exacerbate ocean acidification. And we've been using models to better understand the degree to which those nutrients are posing problems and then folding that into policy actions by the state to address those problems. So that's a bit of a sampling of the different types of actions that we've been doing in investments.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we can pivot to Helen and concluding the panel.
Do we have time for a quick, Jessie, are there any questions from the audience?
This is Jessie. I'd say if there are any questions, go ahead and use the Q&A box that is available through Zoom, and we'll see if we can queue any of those up, but also recognize that we'll wrap up in a couple minutes here. And thank you to all the participants and attendees today. It's been really great to have you here.
So I think we'll just wait to see if any Q&A questions come through. But so in order really to conclude, then we've had a great variety of information here, and this coming decade has been nominated both the UN Decade of Ocean for Sustainable Development and the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. And I think those two tie in very well together. Particularly, we've heard a lot about resilience, both in terms of species and organism resilience, but also community resilience. And I think those words have come up several times in this discussion. But those are two examples of high-level frameworks which can help on-the-ground actions. And there are many others which rely on kind of multi-stakeholder and governmental collaborations to turn knowledge into action. We also know the next 10 years are needed to have rapid action in order to maintain our world below the 2 degrees Paris Agreement. So I just want to kind of conclude quickly by asking the panelists a little bit of a fun thing, hopefully fun. In 3 words, if you can tell us, borrowing from the Decade of the Ocean tagline, well, what is the ocean you want with respect to ocean acidification? And I'll hand that straight back to Ms. Hennessy, first of all.
Well, I know that we were asked for 3 words. I might sneak in a 4th because I think healthy ocean, healthy people is really what I think is what we're all about. As Fran eloquently said, you know, there's a cultural, social, and economic reliance that we all have on the ocean. And so we need to focus on having a healthy ocean so we can have healthy people.
Fantastic. And Director Wilson.
Well, I have to say we've had fun with this. Depending on what part of the day we were thinking about it, we came up with other stuff with different pieces of it. But you know, it really came down to treat it with respect. We talked about things clean, healthy, resilient, even the idea that water is life. But at the end of the day, the scope of the function of the ocean and treating it with respect is what we came down to.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's a good one, that one. And finally, Dr. White, pass that one over to you.
The ocean that I want is productive, resilient, and biodiverse.
Fantastic. So, Jessie, unless we have any comments coming through.
I think I think we have a couple questions for probably past panelists, which I can connect folks with. So, so I think we're okay to conclude, and we'll be right on time, which feels good.
Fantastic. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear from all of the panelists today, and thanks to also to Professor Henderson and Minister Kuv, who've had to leave early for other meetings. I'd just like to wrap up then really by saying we've heard so much about data and science knowledge and how important it is to share that information, particularly when it comes to thinking about regional and local conditions, and we all can connect locally. So although these issues are happening on a much global scale, I don't think we can get away from the fact that we really need to connect down to these local levels. So being able to really directly provide options for actions for stakeholders, for industry, for communities, and we've heard a variety of those, we need to be able to share this data and the science. And I think the ocean acidification community has a set of good networks to really be able to facilitate that. So local activities, I also think, and we've heard this kind of come up as well, is that it's important for engaging society at large, which actually empowers local communities, but it actually feeds back into supporting those higher level activities occurring at governmental and intergovernmental levels. We can put pressure on those activities, but those high level activities such as the UN Decade or the IPCC actually pass down back to us, and they together they feed back in a very sustainable way, hopefully in moving the science forward and moving action forward. So together these different levels of activities can continue and paving the way hopefully for a sustainable, resilient future with respect for the ocean, as we've heard today from all our panelists. So thank you very much again for everyone for joining us. It's been fantastic to connect with you, and hopefully we can follow up with any private comments individually by emails. So with that, goodbye and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.